Unconcerned, contemptuous, violent. This is how wisdom would have us be. She is a woman, she only ever loves a warrior. Thus spake Zarathustra. The fundamental truth about human will, its horror vacue, it must have a goal. Stendhal emphasizes a different effect of the beautiful. The beautiful is a promise of happiness. For him, the fact of the matter seemed to be that the effect of the beautiful was none other than to arouse the will. What does it mean when a philosopher praises the ascetic ideal? We receive here at least a first hint. He wishes to be freed from a form of torture. There exists among philosophers a real bias and warmth in favor of the entire ascetic ideal. All animals, including la bête philosophe, strive instinctively for an optimum combination of favorable conditions, which allow them to expend all their energy and achieve their maximum feeling of power. In beholding the ascetic ideal, the philosopher sees before him the optimum conditions for the highest and boldest spirituality. Every artist knows how harmful the effects of sexual intercourse are when in a condition of great spiritual tension and preparation. A certain asceticism, a severe and serene abstemiousness of the best intentions will be numbered among the conditions which are conducive to the highest spirituality. Oh, how the consciences of the noble races the earth over were loath to renounce the vendetta and submit to the authority of the law. Until very recently, the ascetic priest has assumed the dark, repulsive form of a caterpillar. The ascetic treats life as a wrong track along which one must retrace one's steps to the point at which it begins, or as a mistake which one rectifies through action. For an ascetic life is a contradiction in terms. A particular kind of ressentiment rules there, that of an unsatisfied instinct and will to power which seeks not to master some isolated aspect of life, but rather life itself. Its deepest, strongest, most fundamental conditions. An attempt is made to use strength to dam up the very source of strength. A green and cunning gaze is directed against thriving physiological growth, especially against its expression, beauty, joy, while a pleasure is felt and sought in failure, atrophy, pain, accident, ugliness, arbitrary atonements, self-denial, self-flagellation, self-sacrifice. All this is paradoxical to an extreme. We find ourselves confronted here with a contradiction which wills itself as a contradiction, which derives enjoyment from this suffering, and even becomes increasingly self-assured and triumphant in proportion as its own precondition, the physiological capacity for life, diminishes. The ascetic ideal is derived from the protective and healing instincts of a degenerating life. The ascetic ideal is a trick played in order to preserve life. That this ideal was able to attain power and dominate men to the extent which history demonstrates, particularly wherever the civilization and taming of man was set underway, is the expression of a great fact, the sickliness of the type of man which has existed so far, of the tamed man at least, of this man's physiological struggle against death, more precisely against disgust with life, against exhaustion, against the desire for the end. For man is more sick, more uncertain, more mutable, less defined than any other animal. There is no doubt about that. He is the sick animal. Why is that? Certainly, he has also been more daring, innovative, and defiant, and has challenged fate more than all the other animals put together. He, the great experimenter with himself, the unsatisfied, unsated one, who struggles with animal, nature, and the gods for ultimate mastery. He, the one who remains undefeated, eternally oriented towards the future, who can find no respite from his own compelling energy, so that the spur of the future mercilessly digs into the skin of every present. The more normal sickliness is in man, and we cannot dispute its normality, the more one should respect the rare cases of psychic and physical strength, mankind's strokes of luck, and all the more carefully protect those who are well constituted from the worst air, the air of the sick. The sick represent the greatest danger for the healthy. It is not the strongest, but the weakest who spell disaster for the strong. The sickly constitute the greatest danger to man. Those who are from the outset victims, downtrodden, broken, they are the ones, the weakest are the ones, who most undermine life among men, who most dangerously poison and question our trust in life, in man. The conspiracy of the suffering against the well-constituted and the victorious. Here, the sight of the victor is the object of hatred. They monopolize virtue now, these weak and incurably sick men. There is no doubt about that. We alone are the good, the just. This is the way they speak. We alone are the hominis bonae voluntatis. They wander around among us as living reproaches and warnings, as if health, good constitution, strength, pride, the sense of power, were in themselves marks of depravity, which would at some stage require atonement, bitter atonement. Ah, how ready they are at bottom to compel atonement, how they thirst after the opportunity to be executioners. There is among them a plethora of vindictive men disguised as judges, whose mouths continually secrete the word justice like a poisonous saliva, with lips always pursed, ready to spit at anything which looks content and goes its way in good spirits. Among them, too, there is no shortage of that most revolting species of vain men, the deceitful deformities who are out to play the part of beautiful souls, and to hawk around their ruined sensuality, dressed up in poetry and other swaddling clothes, as purity of heart, the species of moral onanist, and those who indulge in self-satisfaction. The will of the sick to display any form of superiority, its instinct for secret paths, which lead to a tyranny over the healthy. Where is it not to be found, this will to power of the weakest? The sick woman in particular, her techniques of domination, compulsion, and tyranny are unsurpassed in their refinement. To that end, the sick woman spares nothing living, nothing dead. She disinters the most deeply buried things. The Bogos say, woman is a hyena. Look behind the scenes of every family, every organization, every community. The struggle of the sick against the healthy is everywhere to be found. A silent struggle for the most part, with poison in small doses, with pinpricks, with sly games of long-suffering expressions, but also with that Pharisee tactic of the sick, the loud gesture, whose favorite part is that of righteous indignation. Without doubt, once they succeeded in forcing their own misery, the whole of misery as such, into the conscience of the fortunate, so that these latter would one day begin to feel ashamed of their good fortune, and perhaps say to one another, "It is a disgrace to be fortunate. There is too much misery." But there could be no greater or more disastrous misunderstanding than when the fortunate, the well-constituted, the powerful in body and soul begin to doubt their right to good fortune in this way. That the sick should not infect the healthy with their sickness, which is what such a weakening would represent. This ought to be the prime concern on earth, but that requires, above all, that the healthy should remain segregated from the sick, protected even from the sight of the sick, so that they do not mistake themselves for the sick. The higher should not reduce itself to an instrument of the lower. their right to exist, the prerogative of the bell with a full tone over the one which is cracked and out of tune, is 1,000 times greater. They alone are the guarantors of the future. They alone are under an obligation to the future of mankind. So may we have good company, our company, or isolation if necessary, but away in any case from the foul smell of inner corruption and the secret worm fodder of the sick. If one has grasped in all profundity, and here especially I insist on a profound grasp, a profound understanding, how it simply cannot be the mission of the healthy to wait on the sick, to heal the sick, then one has understood one further necessity, the necessity for physicians and nurses who are themselves sick. And here we hold in both hands the meaning of the ascetic priest. We must regard the ascetic priest as the predestined savior, shepherd, and advocate of the sick herd. Only then do we begin to understand his tremendous historical mission. The dominion of the suffering is his realm. The priest is the prototype of the more delicate animal, intent on sowing pain, self-division, self-contradiction wherever he can, and only too sure of his skill in mastering those who suffer at all times. He brings salves and balsam, there is no doubt, but he needs to wound before he can cure. Then, in relieving the pain he has inflicted, he poisons the wound, for this is his particular area of expertise, this magician and tamer of predators, in whose circle everything healthy necessarily falls sick, and everything sick is tamed. This strange shepherd, he engages his cunning in a tough and secret struggle against the anarchy of the herd, the continual fret of its disintegration, the herd in which that most dangerous explosive substance, ressentiment, is piled ever higher. Every suffering man instinctively seeks a cause for his suffering. Someone must be to blame for the fact that I do not feel well. This kind of reasoning is characteristic of all sickly people, and all the more so the more the true cause of their not feeling well, the physiological one, remains hidden. The suffering are gifted with a horrific readiness and inventiveness in finding pretexts for painful feelings. They even enjoy being suspicious, grumbling over misdeeds and apparent insults. They rummage through the entrails of their past and present in search of dark, questionable stories, which allow them to revel in a painful mistrust and to intoxicate themselves on their own malicious poison. They tear open the oldest wounds. They bleed from scars long healed. They make evildoers out of friends, wives, children, and whatever else is closest to them. I am suffering. Someone must be to blame. This is how all sickly sheep think. If someone cannot deal with spiritual suffering, then, to put it crudely, this is not the fault of his spirit, but more probably that of his stomach. To put it crudely, as I said, which in no way expresses the desire to be heard crudely, to be understood crudely. A stronger man with a better constitution digests his experiences, deeds, misdeeds included, as he digests his meals, even when the food is tough. If he cannot deal with an experience, then this kind of indigestion is as much a matter of physiology as the other kind, and is in fact often only one of the consequences of the other kind. Deep depression, latent fatigue, and black sadness of those who are physiologically inhibited. The wrong diet, alcoholism in the Middle Ages, the nonsense of vegetarians, which, admittedly, has the authority of Shakespeare's foolish knight, Sir Andrew Aguecheek, on its side, or from blood poisoning, malaria, syphilis, and the like. The German Depression after the 30 Years' War, which afflicted half of Germany with serious illness and thus prepared the ground for German servility, German faint-heartedness. This domineering listlessness is combated through means which reduce the feeling of life itself to its lowest point. Where possible, will and desire are eliminated entirely. Everything which produces feeling, which produces blood, is avoided. A salt-free diet, the hygiene of the fakir. No love, no hatred, equanimity, no revenge, no self-enrichment, no work, begging. Where possible, no women, or as few as possible. With respect to the spiritual, Pascal's principle, il faut s'abattre, is adopted. The result, expressed in terms of psychology and morality, is the loss of the self, sanctification, in physiological terms, hypnosis, the attempt to achieve for man something approximating hibernation for some kinds of animal, estivation for many plants in a hot climate, the minimum metabolic rate which maintains life below the level of real consciousness. It will not be easy for us to take seriously the way in which these men who are tired of life, too tired even to dream, appreciate deep sleep. The hypnotic feeling of nothingness, the rest of the deepest sleep, the absence of pain, in short, the suffering and fundamentally disgruntled hold this as the highest good. The strongest, most life-affirming drive, the will to power. From a desire to shake off their stifling listlessness and sense of weakness, all the sick and sickly strive instinctively after a herd organization. The strong are as naturally inclined to disperse as the weak are to congregate. When the former join together, it is only with a view to an aggressive collective action and satisfaction of their will to power, and with much reluctance on the part of individual conscience. The latter, on the other hand, take pleasure in the very act of assembly. In the process, their instinct is satisfied to the same extent that the instinct of the born masters, that is, the solitary predatory species of man, is deeply irritated and disturbed by organization. The means of the ascetic priest which we have encountered so far, complete dampening of the feeling of life, mechanical activity, modest pleasures, foremost among these being love of one's neighbor, organization in herds, the awakening of a communal feeling of power, by means of which the individual's frustration with himself is submerged by his pleasure in the thriving of the community. The master stroke which the ascetic priest permitted himself in order to play heart-rending and enraptured music of all kinds upon the human soul was, as everyone knows, his exploitation of the sense of guilt. If one wishes to suggest that such a system of treatment has improved man, I will not dispute that. I would only add what I understand by improved. Much the same as tamed, weakened, discouraged, refined, pampered, emasculated. Much the same, then, as damaged. But when it is administered to the sick, the disgruntled, and the depressed, then such a system always makes the sick man sicker. The ascetic ideal and its cult of sublime morality has thus carved its fearful and unforgettable inscription into the whole history of mankind. One might without any exaggeration call this the true disaster in the history of the health of European man. Wherever he has come to dominance, the ascetic priest has ruined the health of the mind. Realize with whom one is actually dealing, with men who suffer but refuse to admit as much to themselves, with anesthetized and insensate men who fear one thing only, being brought to consciousness. Up to now, the ascetic ideal has dominated all philosophy. Do not come to me with science when I am looking for the natural antagonist of the ascetic ideal. Seriousness, the most unmistakable sign of a straining metabolism, of an increasingly arduous struggle for life. Take a look at the periods in the history of a people in which the scholar comes to the fore. They are times of exhaustion, often of twilight, of decline. The predominance of mandarins is never a good sign, just as little as the advent of democracy, of international courts of peace instead of wars, of equal rights for women, of the religion of compassion, and whatever other symptoms there are of life in decline. Is the very self-belittlement of man not continuing its inexorable progress? Oh, the belief in his worth, uniqueness, irreplaceability in the chain of being is a thing of the past. He has become an animal in the literal sense, without qualification or reservation. He, who previously believed himself almost a god. Modern historiography. It affirms as little as it denies. It ascertains. It describes. All this is ascetic to a high degree, but it is at the same time, and to an even higher degree, nihilistic. Make no mistake. Absolute, honest atheism is not the antithesis of the ideal which it appears to be. It is rather only one of the last phases of its development. Sankhya philosophy, which was then popularized and turned into a religion by Buddha. We can no longer conceal from ourselves what this willing directed by the ascetic ideal actually expresses in its entirety. This hatred of the human, and even more of the animal, of the material, this revulsion from the senses, from reason itself, this fear of happiness and beauty, this yearning to pass beyond all appearance, change, becoming, death, desire, beyond yearning itself. All this represents, may we be bold enough to grasp this, a will to nothingness, an aversion to life, a rebellion against the most fundamental preconditions of life, but which is and remains nonetheless a will. And to say once again in conclusion what I said at the beginning, man would rather will nothingness than not will at all.